It's really nice to see so many of you here, considering how beautiful the weather is. So I'm going to start you off with a very, very easy question, just to wake you up. Easy, right? If you're anything like most audiences, the thing that these things have in common would first of all be that most of us don't know what they are. Second of all, just to give the secret away, they're all applied mathematical sort of algorithmic techniques to make sense of very large data sets. So essentially they're kind of the things that very clever mathematicians use to take huge data sets and derive kind of meaningful information from them. Why am I showing this? Because it is my contention that although most of us will not have seen these terms before, or maybe have heard of them but don't use them, that the next generation of language teachers will be schooled in these types of techniques, at least receptively, at least in terms of knowing what these things are and how they might be relevant. Maybe not necessarily productively, becoming mathematicians, that's taking it a step too far. But I see this happening already around the world in teacher education programs, where really the expectation is that our graduates move beyond just knowing how to use a computer and direct students to the right website, but really are able to gain deep insight into the learning process, into the teaching process, not just within their own classrooms, but also within the institution and beyond. Okay, so what I'd like to do is just to give you a little bit of introduction to why I think this is actually really relevant to us, and give you some hopefully practical examples of how you might be able to start with this type of stuff tomorrow, if you like. Although if the weather's like this, you probably would want to do something else other than explore Bayesian networks. Why is learning analytics so important and growing at the moment? One of the reasons is that, of course, we have more data than we've ever had before. It's also more easily accessible to us than ever before, and we also have better tools available to us that make it easier for a non-specialist, a non-technical person to be able to make sense of them. And that's largely, I think, because of two developments. One is miniaturization of technologies, and the other is the fact that technology is becoming much, much cheaper and much more embedded in our everyday lives. And I want to show you a couple of examples, because I think we can learn a lot from other domains, other disciplines, like health sciences, where a lot of very, very interesting work is being done. What you're looking at here, I was just at Michigan State University. This is the Michigan Micro Mote. And just to give you a sense of scale, it's sitting on the edge of a coin, okay? This is a fully functioning PC. This is not a chip. It's a fully functioning PC. If you were able to connect a keyboard to it, you could use this as a computer. Now, what it also means then is that suddenly you could, and yes, people have tried, put this into a pill and swallow it, all right? So you have a fully functioning PC running around your bloodstream, yeah? Being able to monitor things like your glucose levels, oxygen levels, and what have you. Now, why is that interesting? It's interesting because it means that the information that it gathers, the data, I should say, that it gathers, can be shared with you, but also with your doctor. In fact, it can be shared with your doctor to the point where your doctor gets an alert, says, Hayo, your patient, has over the last few weeks had an increase in his glucose levels or whatever, yeah? You better bring him in, because something is not right with him. So you get a phone call from your doctor, and she would say, you're sick. Yeah, I knew that, but what's new? No, you need to come in. But I'm feeling fine. Maybe now, but if you don't come in, So what that means, it's a form of predictive, proactive healthcare. And here's another example of that, and I'll make the link with education soon, I promise. But this is a company that's been around for quite a long time. As you can see, they develop kind of pressure-sensitive tiles. So that means that the room can know that there is somebody in the room and how many people, okay? So that's useful, for example, to measure whether the library is being used or whether there are rooms in your school that are being underutilized, because you know when somebody is there and when there isn't. But also, what this company has done, again in healthcare, is measure the the pressure, the specific pressure that somebody applies when they walk over these tiles. Now, every one of us has an individual gait. It's actually as individual as your fingerprint and your iris. So if the room knows how you normally walk, and if over a course of a few weeks, few months, maybe, you just start to apply a little bit more pressure to one leg, that could indicate maybe osteoporosis or some health issue. And again, you might get a phone call from the hospital saying, come in. Okay, so proactive healthcare. That's very, very interesting. This here is a patent that was applied for a few years ago by Google. Samsung's got a similar one. These, of course, are lenses that you put in. They're not to help you see better, but they measure bodily fluids and also provide healthcare information to your GP, but also a new development allow you to overlay what you're looking at in the real world with additional information, electronic digital information, so augmented reality. So you could imagine an application whereby if I'm wearing this as a non-native speaker and I'm speaking to someone, that translation would appear in front of my eyes, literally as I'm looking at you, and I don't have to hold up a cell phone or use a computer to do that. So the big change here, and the really fundamental change, is this idea of moving from reactive to proactive support. Now, if you take that idea from healthcare and apply it to education, you've got something potentially quite powerful. At the moment, our education system is very reactive. We wait for somebody to complete a test, and we use the scores, and then we say to them, sorry, you failed this course, you're going to have to do the year again. That's at the end of the year. If, however, we had some way of determining that someone might be potentially at risk before they actually start failing, well, that would be much, much better, because we could save everybody a lot of time and hassle. So, what does that mean for us? Well, it means that we're, over time, probably going to have to develop a range of new skills. We're pretty good in terms of education. We know a lot about language, we know a lot about our learners. We're domain experts in that field. People who design the technology don't have those skills, don't have that knowledge. We're also going to be, a lot more curators, people who identify the right types of resources. As we've known for 30 years, 40 years, we've had access to huge amounts of learning resources, but we're still not very good at helping learners find the right types of resources, and we're still not very good at teaching learners how to be able to find the right kinds of resources for themselves. We're also increasingly going to be kind of trying to figure out how we can best coach learners using a lot of data that we have, a lot of insights that we can gain about these learners, about each individual learner and how their learning journey, their trajectory develops, and make adjustments very individually to each individual learner. Some of us might develop a little bit more in terms of technical skills as coders and programmers, but I think most of the time, again, this will be receptive knowledge. We don't need to do that work ourselves, but we do need to be able to talk to people who do that sort of work. A big one, I think, increasingly is interface experts. So if you've got, for example, smartphones, they're very helpful tools, but they're not very good at displaying large amounts of text, for example. We still haven't really, as educators, as language teachers, figured out a good way of taking textbooks and taking websites and so on and putting them into maybe a smaller format that can easily be used in small bite-sized chunks by learners throughout the day and throughout their learning. Learning engineers, and of course, the one that we're talking about today here, data analysts. You will have a lot more data at your disposal. You'll need to be able to figure out what to do with it in a way that we feel is pedagogically beneficial. And that's the big thing here. That's the risk that we're running, is that the data is being foisted upon us with the demands that go with it, without the pedagogical need that we, as the domain experts, need to bring into that. So there's both a risk as well as a real potential there. And briefly, in terms of research, what is fascinating is that if you have access to very large sets of data about your learners, it potentially fundamentally changes the nature of research. At the moment, if you want to figure out what your learners are doing, you have to take a sample out of a population, and you have to take a moment in time to figure out what it is that they are doing and what they've learned. But what if you could observe not just a sample of your population, but all the learners? And not in one moment in time, but all the time. What if you could observe what learners are doing at any given moment across classes, across cohorts, maybe even across schools? You could literally observe what is happening educationally as you watch it. And that, as Halfpenny and Proctor say, is actually almost like a new type of new type of computational science that is neither purely quantitative and purely qualitative. But it does need people like us who understand the pedagogy to make sense of it, because there's a lot of data there, but not all of it is useful information. So the key underlying question with all this is, yes, the technology is clearly developing very quickly, very interesting, fascinating, but what is the relationship between learning and teaching, and what is the impact that it might have? And this is where learning analytics and data mining come in. I'm not going to talk too much about the theory and the definitions, but essentially, data mining deals with the development of methods to explore data originating in an educational context. So it's any kind of data from an educational context. And learning analytics is the measurement, collection, analysis, and reporting of data about learners and their contexts for purposes of understanding and optimizing learning and the environments in which it occurs. So note, optimizing learning. It's not just about generating huge amounts of data. It's about the learning. Educational data mining is a little bit more inductive and reductive and focuses more on individual parts of the learning process. Learning analytics is more holistic and focuses more on the learner's journey and their experiences. For the purposes of our discussion today, I kind of equate them. You can kind of consider them to be the same, two sides of the same coin, so to speak, okay? So, what sort of data is it that we're talking about? What is all this data that is being generated? Well, we've seen new technologies that will inevitably generate huge amounts of data, but you're actually already, most of us, sitting on very, very large sets of data that many, if not most of us, don't actually actively use, right? If your school uses a learning management system of any sort, whether it be Blackboard or Moodle or some other system, wow, have you ever looked at it very closely? The information that it provides, that it's already in there, is terrific. Now, if you download it into, say, an Excel spreadsheet, there's usually a lot more that is being recorded that is not displayed in nice graphs. So overcome your fear of numbers and have a good look at that and see what's in there. I remember when I finished high school, I promised myself I would study anything that would not have anything to do with math. So I chose Arabic and Hebrew as my undergraduate. Studied that for a while and then liked languages and thought, okay, applied linguistics. Can't be further away from all this sort of stuff. And then, of course, in the first semester, one of the courses I had to take was statistics. So, but my point is that a lot of that is not esoteric. It's not kind of vague data that is floating out there somewhere. It's this sort of stuff, okay? And we can make sense of this because if you look at, basic stuff, how frequently are students logging in? Well, that tells you something. Have you ever considered how you could interpret that and what it might mean? Have you ever looked to see how that figure might be different from your colleagues' class? And if so, why? Have you ever maybe considered how that number compares to your own teaching last year? And how it might change depending on any PD that you've done, okay? So here's an interesting finding and a question for you. University of Maryland used the LMS that they had, and they observed something interesting, by chance actually. They noticed when they were looking through their LMS data across the university, so this is not language education, this is all subjects, that students who had low grades used the learning management system at the university 40% less than students who had C grades or higher. Okay, so think about that for a moment. Let's say that you're the provost or the president of that university, and your IT people come to you and say, look at this, that's interesting. What would you do if you knew that? Search, research, find out more, sure, of course. This is just an observation, so we need to know, what causes that, for sure. What else?
I would try to find out about the two different groups, what other studying they do. Because to my mind, the fact that it's the LMS is kind of neither here nor there. It's about study habits.
Yeah, yes, you're right. So you're right. The LMS is just an indicator. In itself, it doesn't, what do I care whether somebody uses an LMS or not? If you can learn successfully without it, good for you, right? But it does point us to something. Sorry?
The chicken or the egg?
Yes, yeah. Which one comes first? In a way, you're right, but in a way, it doesn't matter. We've observed a problem, okay? Now, we don't know why the problem exists, and it might be because different groups of learners, respond differently, whatever. We need to do more research, as you said. But we do have one very, very, very important piece of information. We now have a proxy measure. Proxy measure is a measure that tells you something about something else. So you don't have to investigate that something else. You can just look at the proxy measure to get a sense of what is going to happen maybe later. Okay, remember that proactive, healthcare, proactive education. So now, if you were the president of this university, you might say, well, for reasons at this point unknown, we'll investigate more, we need to watch out and look at our students' LMS use as early on in the new semester as possible. Because we know that if you're in a group where you're not really accessing the LMS, you're at risk, right? So we don't have to wait till the end of the semester for you to fill your courses. You've wasted your time, we've wasted your money. We can probably say after, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, what would you think is a reasonable amount of time? Maybe a month, first week everybody's new and not a good time, but maybe after a few weeks, you can kind of start to see who is actively engaged and who's not. Well, then you go to the students who are not actively engaged and you say, do you need help? Is something bothering you? Is there any support that we can offer you? Okay? So let's try this one more time, here from the UK. So Nottingham Trent found a strong link with retention, whether students drop out or stay at the university. Less than a quarter of the students with a low average engagement progressed to the second year, whereas over 90% of students with good or high average engagement did so. Same question. You're the head of the school or whatever. Somebody comes to you with this information. What would you do? How would you change your practice? Now, we can ask lots of questions like what is engagement and how do you measure engagement? And we'll come to that in a second. But sure, there's something here. There's a proxy measure here. There's something here around engagement, which might be interpreted a little bit differently between different schools, because we all have our own kind of measures and ideas of how to observe that. But clearly, if you're not engaged, you're far more likely to drop out and leave the university. So, what are you going to do? Probably figure out a way to measure, observe engagement as early on in the semester as possible. Okay? So, how about in-class engagement? I'm not in favor or against any of the programs that I'm showing you here. I'm just showing to you as examples because many of you will have heard of these. So programs like Socrative and Class Dojo and Seesaw are the types of programs that are sometimes, and rightly, criticized. Are we familiar with these programs? So they're kind of classroom software, and especially, I kind of like Class Dojo, so you have your class, kids on your tablet, you can see who's sitting where. So it's a good thing for attendance, for example, who's there. Well, let's take attendance for a moment. Let's say that you take attendance, and you do that for 6 months or a year. Well, that's valuable information. Download it, what are the patterns? Why is it that after 3 months, suddenly we see a drop-off in attendance? Why is it that your students in your class are attending more than my students? Maybe I need to have a chat with you, because you're doing something right. What's your secret? Okay. How about between schools? You know, how about from one year to the next? But of course, in programs like Class Dojo, you can also assign to individual learners like a compliment, or you can recognize things like, hey, you worked really well together with your neighbor. Yeah, so you can reward and record a +1, badge or sticker or whatever for collaboration. Yeah, or good try. You got the wrong answer, but you spoke up and you took the risk, and I'm going to reward that, even though your answer was wrong. Okay? Now, if you do that as a teacher, of course, again, all of that information you can download, put it into an Excel spreadsheet. You don't need to know much more than how to sum it and take the average, and you can see how, for example, you introducing a new technology or a new way of teaching or a new whatever might have an impact on these types of engagement measures. Okay? Seesaw's nice. My daughter is 6. She just started school, and they use it. And it's similar, but it's also an online portfolio. So the students, the kids, kind of record their own thoughts about their learning, what they liked, what they didn't like. They kind of rate and rank themselves and give themselves stickers. And that, of course, provides a huge amount of data, but also, this is interesting, it's made available to the parents. So it's teacher, students who are in control, so that the teacher can add stuff, but it's the student's portfolio. They're ultimately being taught or encouraged to take control over their learning and kind of be reflective. And the parents, the community. So suddenly, I'm at work and I get a message saying, oh, here's a picture of what, Eilina did in class today. And I can write a comment and say, oh, that's beautiful, well done. So it kind of opens up the classroom quite a bit. So these types of technologies do allow us to record, actually really quite easily, on day-to-day practice, information about our students. And if we think about it carefully, we can use it to identify early on whether somebody might be likely to be in need of targeted support. If you record during the class using Socrative or something like that, how people responded to different activities and exercises in class, and you can see patterns, well, you can provide really quite specific feedback. You can also predict student performance to some extent. Now, there's a risk here as well, because you don't want to, already assume that you know everything about a learner based on their prior experience and their prior performance, for example, in the class before yours. So there is a balance to be struck there. You do want to keep an open mind, but at the same time, if you know that a student had trouble concentrating or with a particular language skill or whatever in the class before, well, surely you're going to try and use that information to improve your instruction, right? The other big one is increased transparency. So now, your classroom, for better or worse, is not necessarily closed off to other people anymore. In fact, if you do share this data, and the schools that are experimenting with this are doing this usually as a collaborative, as a team effort, then we agree that you will see everything that I do in my class and everything that goes on in my class, and the attendance and the engagement and the success or failure of my teaching, if you will, and you agree to share yours with me as well. So I'll show you mine if you show me yours, and then we come together and we figure out, hey, look, we observed this. What are we going to do about this, right? So there's a huge amount of transparency. Now, not everybody likes that, but if you're the head of school, it's certainly a very powerful tool to, if you use it, productively and constructively, to perhaps identify issues, dare I say it, with teaching, with teachers, prior to those issues becoming major problems for the students. Right? So there is a bit of a kind of a big brother concern here, clearly, Because do you really want everybody else to constantly be able to kind of look over your shoulder virtually and see what's happening in your classes? Is that, I'm not saying it's good or bad, but there is a concern there, and you need to reflect on it and make a decision if and how much you want to share. And I think most of us, especially the people in this room, we're quite keen to do whatever we can to help our learners learn better. So most of us would probably be quite happy to, in the spirit of transparency, to share more within confined groups. Largely also because of the final point, I think one of the most valuable benefits of using this type of analytics is that it doesn't need to be limited to you. You can share the data with your students. You can share the tools to manage that with your students. Now that's very, very empowering, because as a student I can see how well I participated in class last semester and this semester, how much I engaged, what my test scores were and how they compared to other students. And that's one of the things that we investigated with Michael Thomas from Central Lancashire and some other people in Europe with the Vital project, where one of the things that we found was, like, if you give the tool set to the students, most students love that because it visualizes for them their learning journey. They can see when, what happened, where. So it's not just the teacher once every few weeks giving them a score or a number, but it's them actually being able to work with it. That's a very different, approach to education. Now, interestingly, because a lot of this is new, it's not always clear when students do want to see this type of data and when they don't. And one of the things we found here is that Chinese learners did not really want to see their scores compared with other students, for whatever reason. Whereas the non-Chinese students in the initial pilot study loved being able to compare themselves with other students and their class with other students. So we need to figure it out, but it requires people like us, domain experts, to ask those types of questions. So I'll finish with a few challenges and I think a few opportunities for you, maybe something to think about in the coming questions. I know, Eric, that you've got some questions for the audience as well, but I guess the first one is, what data do you have access to already? It could be exam scores, it could be attendance records, it could be your LMS, it could be whatever software you use, it could be the online data that the Cambridge resources that we all love and use record for us. Yeah, there is much more than you actually think there is. What could it tell you? Be open-minded. What are the potential proxy measures that exist within that? You may need to build some new skills. I think it's fairly limited. I think a reasonable command of Excel for most of us will be sufficient. Some of you may want to use SPSS, but you don't actually need all that much. You need to have a good think about, what are the obvious security, privacy, and what have you concerns. Clearly, we've had that with the internet, we've had that with smartphones, now we're having it with data. Let's not shove it under the carpet, but let's empower ourselves by thinking about it so it doesn't get foisted upon us, but we can make an active decision about when and how much to use this type of data and how much to share with other people. And then the hard ones, because we are, I think, at a point where potentially the use of data can do more than just give us a few more insights. It can potentially lead to a transformation, I think, of education, where we can move from a fairly reactive system to one where, for better or worse, we know a lot more about the individual learner, where they've come from, what they've done, what their challenges are, how they might compare to other groups, which of our students might be at risk, which students are starting off well but then are dropping off and need extra support for whatever reason. So we are starting to be able to predict, like, hey, with your background and your profile, you're going to need more support in that area. So you know what? I'm going to arrange it for you now, 3 months before you even knew you needed it. So that's very, very powerful. How can we create an environment, of course, where this is done with trust and collaboration, where people, especially us as teachers, feel that we're in control of this, where it's not just the computer scientists saying, here's databases and telling you how to use it. And I think the main one, how can we use this for good? How can we show our students that they can take control over their own learning? And especially, of course, moving from, say, primary to secondary school, secondary to tertiary, from one class to another class, with the best intentions. A lot gets lost during those transition points from one teacher or one course or one school to the next. Why not give the students a lifelong opportunity to reflect on and think about and chart their own learning using these kinds of tools? So I'll leave it at that.